There are a lot of ballet schools in this world. The famous ones, the ones people actually argue about, are the French school, the Russian school, and the American school. Until the middle of the 80s, that was the whole conversation. Nobody imagined a fourth contender was about to shove its way into the room. But nothing lasts forever. And in 1988, out from behind the backs of all those old masters, jumped the Belgian school of ballet, sometimes called the Flemish school. And the entire reason for its rise was one single man, a kid named Jean-Claude Camille François Van Varenberg. Today I want to talk about that triumphant arrival on American soil, and then spend a lot more time on the long, spectacular sunset of the muscles from Brussels. Unlike a lot of actors, Jean-Claude Van Damme built himself from nothing. He came to America at the very start of the 80s, and he started at the absolute bottom. For a while, nobody paid the slightest attention to the signals he was sending. He scraped by on whatever work he could find. The future action star delivered pizza. Between shifts, the Belgian ran to every audition he could find, and one of them landed him a movie called Monaco Forever. That was not actually his first time on screen. Back in 1979, he turned up in a Belgian film called Woman Between Wolf and Dog. Rutger Hauer had one of the leads in that one. Nobody noticed the most famous Belgian in the world standing in the background. And nobody noticed him in Monaco Forever either. That film ran 48 minutes and got destroyed by audiences and critics alike. Van Damme's career almost ended before it started, and what saved it was meeting Chuck Norris and the Cannon Group. In 1984, Chuck Norris invited Van Damme onto Missing in Action to serve as a human punching bag. You cannot actually spot him in the finished film. He is back there somewhere doing stunt work in the deep background, but working as a heavy bag for Chuck Norris would pay off later. First, though, Van Damme decided to be in a science fiction movie called Predator. There are about 5 different legends about what happened. One version says Francois could not read the fine print on his contract and signed up for a movie where his face would never appear on screen. Another says he behaved like a lunatic on set and kept trying to land that famous Belgian kick on somebody and got fired for landing it successfully. Jesse Ventura is the one who insists on that version. A third version says he was simply too short, and standing next to Arnold, he looked openly comical. Originally, the Predator looked like some kind of alien giraffe, which made Van Damme's height less obvious. Once the design got reworked, the need for a small Belgian on set evaporated. A couple of frames of him survived in the movie anyway. People say the outraged black creature running through the jungle is him. In 1986, Van Damme got a role as one of the villains in No Retreat, No Surrender. That movie was enormously popular in Russia during the video parlor era, which is roughly the American equivalent of every mom-and-pop rental shop having one worn-out copy behind the counter. Van Damme played a Russian fighter named Ivan. The Belgian desperately needed a breakout role, and he was doing absolutely everything to get noticed. With No Retreat, No Surrender, he got lucky in a manner of speaking. The script was being written as they shot, and everyone was improvising on set, and Van Damme was the runaway champion of improvisation. For $250 a day, he beat up roughly half the cast. If the script called for 1 strike, Jean-Claude delivered 4. If they asked for 2, he gave them 10. The 2 people who suffered most from Van Damme's improvising were Timothy Baker and Peter Cunningham. Cunningham was a 7-time world champion kickboxer, and Van Damme knocked him out cold twice in a single shooting day with a jumping, spinning kick. Baker was supposed to take 1 kick to the upper chest. Van Damme kicked him in the face, the knee, and the throat, repeatedly, and kept going even after director Corey Ewan was screaming at him to stop. Baker stayed angry about it for years. He got his moment later, when a more famous Van Damme was in court over an injury to an actor named Jackson Rock Pinkney on the set of Cyborg. Baker showed up and testified that Van Damme was dangerous to work with and did not have adequate control of his movements for a martial artist. While shooting No Retreat, No Surrender, Van Damme was barely making rent. After a day of filming, he would regularly ask other actors to help push his car, an East German Trabant, a cardboard-bodied communist economy car with a lawnmower engine. Without a running start, it would not turn over. The movie was not a big hit, but it comfortably made its budget back, and it is the film that got him into Bloodsport. He used it to hammer on the door at Cannon, trying to reach a producer Chuck Norris had introduced him to years before. Here he got very lucky, although in 1986 it did not look lucky at all. They handed him a script that had been sitting dead on the shelf for 2 years. The movie cost $1.5 million, had a miserable production, and after shooting wrapped in 1986, it went straight onto the shelf. The test screenings were a disaster, and Cannon did not want to put it in theaters. The only good thing to come out of that was a movie called Black Eagle, where Van Damme played another Russian villain, this time named Andrei. Because nobody knew about Bloodsport yet, Van Damme had to sign a 2-picture deal with Imperial Entertainment for roles he could easily have played in the far background. Even though he was not a star, they rewrote parts of the Black Eagle script for his character right before shooting, and per tradition, the Belgian immediately started hitting every actor within reach. That included the leading man, Sho Kosugi. The story goes that Kosugi put up with precise strikes to his own face from a very pleased Francois for a long time, then finally snapped and started hitting the Belgian kid back. It ended with people pulling them apart, and with Van Damme refusing to die at Kosugi's hands in the finale. So they rewrote the ending in a hurry, and Van Damme died heroically under a boat propeller instead. After working on that masterpiece, Van Damme realized that propeller could bury his entire career. And here is the moment that decided everything that followed. He decided to become an editor. He was convinced Bloodsport was the movie that could save him, so he talked the bosses at Cannon into handing him all the raw footage and letting him cut a real movie out of it. And Jean-Claude produced a version of Bloodsport that satisfied every producer in the room. So in 1988, 2 years after filming ended, it finally reached theaters. Black Eagle never made it to a theater at all, which probably worked out in the Belgians' favor. Bloodsport did extremely well for its budget. It took in $12 million in America and another $18 million in the rest of the world. In France, 1 million people bought a ticket to see the legendary Belgian. The career, as they say, took off. But first came Cyborg, which nearly buried it again. Director Albert Pyun assembled the Cyborg script out of 2 dead Cannon projects. The first was a sequel to the failed Masters of the Universe with Dolph Lundgren. The second was based on Marvel Comics, a Spider-Man movie. Cannon needed to recover the money already sunk into developing both. Combined, they had spent more than $1.5 million on pre-production. Every asset, every costume, every set went into Cyborg. Cyborg itself only cost $500,000 because by then Cannon was convulsing from a long run of flops. They shot it fast, wherever they could, and almost every actor in the movie played several roles, all of which showed up in the test screenings, which turned into a catastrophe. Exactly 1 viewer out of 100 gave the movie a positive score. Nobody wanted to shelve this one, though. The frustrated producers wanted to dump Cyborg into theaters as fast as possible, get rid of it, and recover something. And then Van Damme inserted himself into the equation again and talked them into giving him time for a new cut. This is also where that court case came from. During filming, Van Damme struck Jackson Rock Pinkney in the face with a prop knife. Pinkney was partially blinded in his left eye and was discharged from the army as a result. He sued, and Van Damme had to pay him. The exact amount was never made public. Cyborg did fine in theaters, though it could not repeat Bloodsport. On a $2 million budget, it took $10 million in American theaters, and the rest of the world contributed some pocket change that nobody has exact numbers for anymore. After Cyborg came Kickboxer, and that one was a genuine worldwide hit. It cost $1.5 million and pulled in more than $40 million around the world, 15 of that from America. The French occupied their theaters again, and this time German audiences were right behind them. After Kickboxer came the last Van Damme film for Cannon. Everybody will probably agree that the least famous movie of the Belgians' golden period is Death Warrant. Most likely, that is because by then, the studio releasing it was already a corpse. Jean-Claude Van Damme owes Cannon a great deal for giving him his start with Bloodsport. But while the actor's star was burning brighter and brighter, the Cannon star was going dim. That was not Van Damme's fault. His movies made the studio money. The bigger projects were the problem. Things like Over the Top with Sylvester Stallone, which went down in flames. There is one more good detail here. According to Van Damme, he stole the death warrant role right out from under Steven Seagal's nose. You often hear that the two of them fell out simply because of the shots they took at each other in interviews. Shots like Van Damme suggesting that Seagal's sudden expansion was an attempt to change his appearance and hide from the mob. But it did not start with the interviews. It started with Death Warrant. Anyway, as Death Warrant was wrapping up, Cannon decided to go bankrupt. The Belgian was not too upset about it. He finished his obligation and went off to make Lionheart. Cannon's assets started moving over to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and that process was slow, so Death Warrant sat on the shelf for more than a year. Lionheart was more or less an accident for Van Damme. He was pushed into it by that two-picture obligation to Imperial Entertainment, and that obligation forced him to personally come up with the idea for Lionheart and help write the script. Van Damme's contributions included a Scottish kilt on one of the fighters, a white cat, a nod at James Bond, a fight that ends with a single punch, and so on. And obviously the shot of his own bare rear end in one scene was lobbied for by him personally. When it came out, Lionheart was the biggest commercial success of the Belgian's career. It took $24 million in American theaters alone. Its budget was also his biggest at that point, $6 million. There are no worldwide gross figures, but there are admission counts for France and Germany, and for Van Damme they were records. While Lionheart was in theaters, Death Warrant finally passed to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Nobody particularly wanted the film. The studio was collecting it mostly for the sake of collecting it. Plenty of versions of the movie still open with the logo of a studio that no longer existed, Cannon Films. In American theaters, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did handle that detail and swapped the logo out. And here's the funny part. Thanks entirely to Van Damme's rising fame, a movie dumped into theaters 2 years after filming, with zero marketing, forgotten by everyone, still did respectable business. On a $4 million budget, it took $16 million in American theaters. How much the studio made on it in home video? We can only guess. Van Damme, meanwhile, was headed for orbit. His next film, Double Impact, broke his box office record again. Jean-Claude very badly wanted to play two very different twins. The Belgian believes that role helped his image and proved he could play sharply different characters. Not everyone saw the potential. Albert Pyun, who directed Cyborg in 1989, said in an interview that at the end of the 80s, Van Damme came to him with a pitch for a movie about Corsican brothers, twin brothers. Pyun says he told Van Damme the idea was too ridiculous, advised the Belgian not to make garbage like that, and while he was at it, advised him to quit drinking entirely. According to Pyun, after that conversation, the two men never saw each other or spoke again. In America, Double Impact took $30 million. Again, there are no worldwide figures, but in France almost 2 million people saw it, and in Germany 1.5 million. So the $65 to $70 million worldwide figure you sometimes see is believable. Van Damme entered the 90s as a superstar. Every new film made more money than the last. His fees climbed right along with them, and so did his sense of his own importance, and his enthusiasm for various banned substances was not far behind. But as long as he was making money, nobody cared. In 1993, he nearly stumbled on Nowhere to Run. Here is the thing. Nowhere to Run was originally going to be a completely different movie. Joe Eszterhas wrote the script, and director Richard Marquand intended to direct it personally at the end of the 80s, but in 1987, he died of a heart attack. Marquand had Return of the Jedi behind him. In that original script, there were no brawling elements at all, and almost no action whatsoever. All the finished film shares with it is the thread about an escaped convict and a widow with 2 children. The core of the story was a love story. Mel Gibson was supposed to star. After Marquand died, the script was abandoned. And at the start of the 90s, the writer Leslie Bohem reworked it for the action star Jean-Claude Van Damme. Joe Eszterhas publicly disowned Nowhere to Run, saying nothing of his script survived in the film. The Belgian admitted in an interview that he did not like the story at all, but the writer shook his hand and solemnly promised to fix the script and bring it up to a decent standard. Van Damme believed him and did not turn down the role. When it came time to shoot, it turned out nobody had even attempted to change the script. When it came out, Nowhere to Run was Van Damme's second most expensive movie after Universal Soldier, and the first in terms of what he personally was paid. He got $2.5 million. At the box office, the film took a step backward from his previous work and basically flopped in America. The rest of the world saved Francois and dragged the project to the break-even line. 1994 was the peak of Van Damme's box office career. Time Cop finally crossed the $100 million mark worldwide. And ahead of him glittered an even more expensive film, Street Fighter, which was supposed to be a huge hit. Street Fighter did not exactly flop, but the terrible audience scores and the Belgians' behavior on set both did their work. From there, the career started to stall. The film with the fitting title for the Belgians' career, Sudden Death, came right after Street Fighter and was the last movie for which he was paid a serious fee. They gave him $5 million. Nobody will be surprised to learn the film had a pile of problems long before Van Damme joined it. The script was first offered to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Schwarzenegger passed because he was busy. He was signed to True Lies, and after that, he was supposed to shoot Junior. After Arnold, the offer went to Sylvester Stallone. Stallone read it and said no. According to Sly, the script was raw and needed work. The third actor to get the offer was Bruce Willis. Willis turned Sudden Death down because he was already deep in preparation for Die Hard with a vengeance. After Willis said no, the producers went to Van Damme and he said yes to the lead, after which the budget was cut nearly in half. The existing script was heavily rewritten right before shooting. Randy Feldman, who wrote the first version, says his script was a parody of an action movie, and that the only scene that made it intact from his work into the finished film is the fight with the hockey team mascot. Sudden Death was Van Damme's first box office failure. The film took $64 million, but against a $35 million budget, that was not enough to be a win. It probably ended up in the black on home video, but the sequel, which already had a finished script by the time Sudden Death opened, was cancelled immediately. Van Damme tried to save the career himself. His contract with Universal let him make The Quest, on which he also directed. But he could not hit the Bloodsport jackpot a second time. Like Sudden Death, the movie came up short in theaters, after which Universal terminated his contract. Around this same time, the Belgian also turned down a villain role in an expensive Warner action film called Sandstorm. Wesley Snipes was supposed to play the good guy. That film never got made and went on the shelf. The stretch of career that follows is very dark. Watching where his career was going, he drank more, partied more, and sank deeper into drugs. Somewhere in here is the famous story about Van Damme getting beaten up at the club scores. That story mostly comes from Mickey Rourke and Chuck Zito, and Zito was the other man in the fight. According to Zito, on that unfortunate night, he made the mistake of saying hello to Van Damme and Mickey Rourke, who had decided to spend the evening at that particular club. The Belgian, apparently well lubricated, immediately got aggressive toward Zito. Not wanting to escalate, Zito said his hello, heard his own last name deliberately mangled, and made a quick exit. And that probably would have been the end of it, except that one of the club employees Zito knew came over and asked why he was smiling and chatting with a man who says ugly things about him behind his back. It turned out that the moment Zito walked away, the club employee had asked the Belgian for an autograph and mentioned that they had a mutual acquaintance, Chuck Zito, and Van Damme responded with mockery and jokes. That is when Zito walked back over to a relaxing Van Damme and asked him to explain himself. What he got in return was the standard arrogance from the Belgian kid, and that he could not take. Zito says he lost it and went at Van Damme with his fists. He beat on the Belgian for maybe 30 seconds. A chair went flying out from under the actor, and dark glasses and black belts went in all directions. Just as Zito was ready to cut Van Damme into strips, security pulled him off. Van Damme himself always walks around this subject, and the only thing he says is that none of it happened. Zito says he even needed medical attention because he managed to injure his hand on Jean-Claude's head. Mickey Rourke and the club owners back Zito's account. But there are also plenty of witnesses who saw a perfectly content Van Damme walking out of the club, calmly handing out autographs, with no signs of demolition on him whatsoever. Since no lawsuit followed, a lot of people are inclined to think there was a small altercation that the press then upgraded into the destruction of the brave Belgian. As for the film career, by this point, things were not merely bad, they were catastrophic. His movies gradually stopped getting theatrical releases. Legionnaire, which was supposed to get one, was hastily pulled from the release schedule after the failure of Knockoff. Then came Inferno, directed by John G. Avildsen, the man who directed Rocky. That $26 million film went straight to video. And then Universal Soldier. The Return detonated, and its box office fiasco drew the line under the theatrical period of François's life. His budget started falling hard, and he did not appear in an American theater again until The Expendables 2. In Europe, some of his films still got small theatrical releases. The Order, Derailed, Replicant, In Hell, Wake of Death all opened in Spain, for example, but took in pennies there. So by the middle of the 2000s, Van Damme had permanently relocated to video. The one modest success worth noting is the crime comedy JCVD, which got a wide release in France, but still could not escape being a commercial failure. After 2010, Van Damme occasionally tries to remind people he exists. Sylvester Stallone helped him a lot with The Expendables, but it did not go much further than that. Attempts to establish himself on television did not succeed either. He kept turning up in films with alarming titles and matching scores, though he did it fairly rarely, which is probably for the best. He clearly could have appeared in that much garbage far more often if he had wanted to. There have been signs of life since. In 2021, he headlined a Netflix comedy called The Last Mercenary, playing a French secret agent, and it did well on the platform. In 2024, he made Darkness of Man, a movie only a devoted fan could love. In 2025, he starred in The Gardener for Amazon, a French action comedy where he plays a gardener who is also a killing machine. And in 2022, he announced that he intended to retire with one final film called What's My Name, a semi-autobiographical story in which he plays himself, loses his identity, and fights opponents from his own past. He told Deadline he wanted to revisit his career starting from Bloodsport and that he had bought a small boat. Years later, the movie still has not been made and he keeps working, which honestly is the most Van Damme ending possible. He has also apparently made peace with Steven Seagal. In 2025, he posted video from a dinner celebrating Seagal's 73rd birthday and thanked him and his family. The two men who spent 30 years insulting each other in the press ended up at the same table. It is a little sad that he started changing his personality and getting off the substances so late. Maybe things could have gone differently. Maybe after a couple of failures, the studios would not have dropped him like a bag of puppies and would have given the man more chances. But here is the thing about that Belgian school of ballet. It only ever had one dancer. He kicked his way into a conversation that had been going for 300 years, held the floor for about a decade, and then walked off. Nobody has enrolled since, and the World Championship of Ballet went right back to the French, the Russians, and the Americans, exactly the way it was before a pizza delivery guy from Brussels showed up and did the splits. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.